Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast, where we engage in actionable conversations at the intersection of earth care and spirituality. Our aim is to help you become better informed and practically equipped for a lifestyle of impactful earth keeping that flows out of spiritual integration with the ecologies of your place. And while we approach these conversations from our own orientation as Christ followers, this podcast shines light on the storied wisdom of all of us who share in common a love for the whole community of creation, whatever our ideological bent. This is James Amadon, and if you're a regular listener, you know that I am the occasional co-host of this podcast with Forrest Inslee, and also the director of Circlewood, the organization behind the podcast. I'm introducing this episode instead of Forrest because it features Forrest as a guest on a sister podcast called The Holy Wild. I found his conversation with our mutual friend, Victoria Loorz, so engaging that I told Forrest we needed to share it with our listeners. So get ready for an intriguing conversation. You'll hear Forrest share about his journey into a more expansive faith. You'll be encouraged by the signs of new life emerging within the Christian church, exemplified in this episode by the creative work of Bethany Community Church in Seattle. You'll be challenged to deepen your relationship with the creatures and beings that you encounter on a daily basis. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, you will find woven throughout this conversation a sense of hope, which is so needed as we navigate the moment we are living in. So enjoy this stimulating conversation, and I'll return at the end to offer some closing thoughts and suggestions for how we might put the themes of this episode into action in our own lives and communities.
My friend Forrest, thank you so much. You've been so gracious. You've invited me onto your podcast, Earth Keepers, several times, and this is my first opportunity to invite you on our new Holy Wild podcast.
Super excited to be here. Thanks.
I just wanted to begin this conversation around your personal transition. You've done community organizing and even missions work throughout most of your life, but at some point you expanded your understanding and your vision for the beloved community beyond the human. And I'd love to have you share a little bit about what that transition looked like for you.
You know, it wasn't until really recently in conversation with folks in Seminary of the Wild that I made a connection that there's a parallel in my development process between my training as a community developer and my Christian faith practice. In both cases, the culture of community development and the culture of the evangelical church really foregrounded the needs of human beings. So community development for most developers and nonprofits is all about meeting human need, making life better for communities of humans. And parallel to that, I think, the evangelical church, when it talks about the work of Jesus, I think there's been an overbalance in favor of Jesus has come to save human souls and the rest of creation doesn't really matter that much. In both cases, for me, there's been a transition over the years away from that towards something that's more inclusive of the broader community of creation. When I was a graduate student in Chicago, I really thought about coming back to Seattle in order to somehow help people to encounter God in nature. I knew that in the Northwest, a lot of people knew God through their experiences in nature. And I thought, well, why not make that part and parcel of church life and faith practice? But I was part of an evangelical church at that time. And in those days, it was pretty standard to say that that wasn't so important as the saving of souls. So my pastor, when I talked to him about my vision for a different sort of faith practice involving nature, said, well, Jesus didn't die for the mountains and the trees. And I believed it. There was part of me that was ready to believe that. So I don't blame anyone, but that was evangelical culture that I'd grown up with, right? There wasn't room for a more expansive vision of Jesus' reconciliation and repair work to include all of creation and not just human beings. So that led to me being a missionary in Turkey for a number of years, and it was a great number of years. We planted churches and did really cool humanitarian projects. But all along I thought, man, there's something else that I'm missing, that I'm called to, that involves the rest of creation, involves reconnecting to the natural world and making that part of my understanding of faith, my theology, really. So after my term in Turkey, I came back to the Seattle area and was asked to start a graduate program in community development. So I did that. And again, I was up against this assumption in community development that the needs of people were primary. That's what really matters. And it doesn't matter what else you do, as long as human beings are somehow having their lives made better.
Right. So it might be about water, but it's about water for humans.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So relief work is part of community development. And so you see nonprofits go into Haiti after an earthquake, provide food, provide water for the people who needed it desperately, and then they leave. And they would leave behind mountains of trash, of styrofoam and plastic, because there was just no attention given to the impacts beyond human need. So I began to teach in a different way and to help people in the community development world and help my graduate students to understand that community is much bigger than people. That's something that I really was learning from indigenous mentors and teachers, to understand that the goal in life is to be a good relation in the broader family of creation. Expanding that idea of community was coming up against a lot of pushback because the culture was so entrenched. But my students got it, and they are all over the world now trying to influence community developers in that direction. So I do see a change happening, not just because of our program, but I think in general, people have a better sensibility that the environment has to factor in to this work we call community development.
Right. I think there is a change. We're living in this bubble now where most of our connections and people we're working with get it. But I see that it is a bigger change. There's a shift in the world, and there's a shift within the Christ tradition. And it includes this larger, expansive view of community and care and kindness that expands beyond other people. And you've started to see some of those shifts in your podcast and in your relationships. This is a movement, and Christianity is moving beyond old structure. There's something happening, and it's a bigger shift than moving from organs to pianos, or sitting in chairs facing the front to circles and couches. Like, it's something bigger than that. It's more than a reformation, I think, is what we're facing right now. And that gives me hope. And it's not that this is the only piece. There's a lot of, I think, transition that's going to happen, and reformation, and new ways of being human, new ways of being Christian, new ways of being a citizen are emerging. And so I'd love to hear some stories about how people within the inside edges of the Christ tradition are wrestling with this and doing something that is shifting.
I work for an organization called Circlewood, and as part of that job, I do a podcast called Earth Keepers. And Circlewood aims at individuals and communities who are within the Christ tradition. Not exclusively, of course, but those tend to be the people who will come to us for help, for guidance, for assistance, for resourcing. And the podcast reflects that same ethos. I love talking to people who are doing innovative, groundbreaking, creative things in the whole realm of earth care. I'll just give you an example. Ben Lowe of Russia, USA, is a partner to Circlewood. I interviewed him on a podcast recently, and I asked him about the work of Russia. And they work with churches primarily. And I asked him if they face a lot of resistance to that work of bringing creation care into the center of the church's work, into the heart of faith life. And he says, while that was true at one time, it's not true as much anymore. It's not so much fighting against resistance on the part of church, but rather recognizing that churches want more. They understand the need for change, and they're ready to embrace that. So the job of Russia is to help churches to understand, what does that mean for us? They have a program called Churches of Restoration, and that's a program that supports churches on their journey to care for God's creation more deeply. And so I thought that was a really interesting insight, and I think you and I both have watched that happen. We both were working in a time when there was hostility even from the evangelical church to the idea that climate change was real, or that Christians had any kind of responsibility toward creation beyond stewardship.
Stewardship was even 35 years ago when we were working this was evangelical.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so that for me catalyzed the change. I thought, yeah, he's right. Things have shifted. There is a movement toward something different now. And at least a good part of the church is coming to understand the need for relationship with creation, how to care for their places better, how to help their people to be better carers of the earth. Another recent interview that impacted me along these same lines was with David Swanson, and he has written a book called Plundered, The Tangled Roots of Racial and Environmental Justice. And he also talks about a shift. Yes, it's a shift on the part of the church to want to be better earth keepers, but it's also a shift toward wanting to see justice. I think the church has recognized its complicity in the way that Western culture has really abused and objectified the environment. And as churches realize that, they also realize that they're complicit in lots of different kinds of social and environmental injustice. So the question that he helps people to answer is, what does it mean for our church, our community, to be, first of all, repenting for what we've done, but secondly, how do we turn then to something more effective, more productive, more earth-honoring, more just? And that's a hard shift for a culture to make, is to acknowledge wrongdoing and to say we need to pursue a different way forward.
Right. That lack of humility and the centrality, even within the institutional church, of repentance gets so sidelined and so narrow that we can get away with everything else and go, okay, I'm doing this little teeny part of it, so I'm free the rest of my life. It's just inconsistent. And we're not even talking about the far right kind of church that's happening now. But it's wonderful to hear that, because it's probably hard to be an evangelical right now. Even more than being a Christian right now, you're put into a certain category of the more radical right. What Ben Lowe was saying was happening within Arosha and the evangelical church is happening within most denominations, even in the mainline churches. And I think they're really moving beyond, we need to recycle and not use plastic, reducing our carbon footprint, even joining the local climate groups and marching with them. Like, it's beyond that. It's like what's needed in the churches most, and the churches can address this more than any other sector of our society, is the inner change of repentance, of kindness, of love, of restoration. That's what we're about. That's what religion is about. It gives me hope that something is arising. There is something that we are part of, that we are co-creating a new, like Thomas Berry says, a new story.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons I even do the podcast. It's as much for me as for anyone else, because in the midst of all the bad news, you need to pay attention to good news once in a while. And so I get to do that on a regular basis, talk to people who are involved in the good news of creation care. I'm very grateful, actually, to be able to have those conversations. And I'm hoping that other people will benefit from them as well.
I was thinking about something you just said about the Jesus message, the Jesus worldview. I recently picked up Walter Wink, The Powers That Be, that I read 40 years ago. And I needed to just revisit it again. And one of the things he says has really shifted things for me. He's redefining the word cosmos, which is translated in most New Testaments as world. So it's like we need to be separate from the world. The world is the problem. So a lot of the old Christian worldview was that earth is evil. We need to be in heaven and we need to disconnect from the earth. But he translated the word cosmos as worldview. Yes, we live in this empire, and you give to Caesar what is Caesar's. We're here. And there's another way to live. It's not the way of the worldview of domination. It is a new way. So I feel like this movement that's expanding is really narrowing down to what it means to be following the message and the life of Jesus.
Yeah, which I think is ironic. I don't know if you read the news this morning, but Trump is going to rename the Department of Defense as the Department of War, which is just a reflection of a greater ethos of this administration, which is about domination, which is about imposition, which is about control. So it's ironic, don't you think, that as that is happening, a large part of Christendom is not doing that. They're looking at the world in a different way, to use your description of this shift that's happening. So that actually does make the work of turning, of re-theologizing, reimagining what the church is for, what Christians are to do, as subversive work, as work of resistance.
Yeah, it is what gives me some hope, because every X number of years, a new emperor takes over and wants to rule the world. It's just a human story, but it's not forever. It's only a human story for the last few thousand years. So I really do listen to and believe, like Phyllis Tickle, who talks about every 500 years, the massive changes in Christianity, and that we are in the latest one, which she says is as cataclysmic as the coming of Jesus. When I first read that 20 years ago, I was like, really?
Yeah.
And now I see it. Now I can feel it. That's the uprising that will meet. That's why it's getting so crazy, because I think the whole world knows something major is shifting and really not wanting it to change.
Yeah. Change is hard and scary, for sure.
This is the worldview shift we're talking about, which is the work of the church, which is the work of Christianity. It's a worldview shift. It's seeing not a kingdom of emperors, but a kingdom of relationships and love. Do you have any other stories of churches who are making this shift and wrestling with their complicity and then doing something different?
Actually, Circlewood is working with a church right now called Bethany Community Church, and they're in a very urban area of Seattle. They have what's called a wilderness ministry, and they organize a lot of hikes and camping trips and such. And that ministry in their church tends to draw a lot of people who actually encounter God more readily in nature than in any other place. And in many cases, those experiences are more church than anything the church might do on a Sunday. So I think it's been interesting to see that experiment going on. And Circlewood's actually going to be teaching a year-long series on the journey of ecological discipleship to that group over the next years. But we're doing other things too with the church. For example, at the intersection of 3 major roads where the church property is located, there's this very, very big triangle of lawn that has been that for years and years and years, and no one really goes there. No one uses it. They just mow it and water it, and it's dead land in a lot of ways. But what they decided was, rather than change that land into a community garden, which can be an overused response to the desire to care for the land better, they said, well, let's listen to the land and see what it wants to be.
Oh, see, there's the question.
Yeah. Yeah. How to do that is tricky. How do you listen to the land? But listening to the land involves paying attention to history. What was the land before it was urbanized? It involves paying attention to watershed dynamics. So what's the flow of water in this area? Where are the creeks and streams? Where do they drain? And then what kind of ecology does that map out for that particular region? It's also cultural listening. So we know that Native people lived in the area before the coming of white settlers. And so the church has actually done work with the Duwamish people, which is one of the tribal groups from the area, and gets their congregants involved in working alongside the Duwamish in different projects. But to pay attention to the Native American history and stories of the land as well is part of that process of listening to the land. Well, in the end, what they decided was this land wants to be rewilded. And so it took a long time. It was a slow process. Both the listening took time, but also the process of restoration, because in order to kill grass to make room for native species, you don't want to just rip it off the top of the soil, because you're taking away a soil ecology, really. So we covered it with cardboard and wood chips and waited a year for that grass to die, but the ecology of the soil stayed healthy and alive. And then once the grass was dead, we started to plant. We planted lots of different native species. And it was hard to look at first. It looked like a lunar wasteland, because these little native plants are 1 and 2 inches high, and the rest is all like
Right.
bark chips, right? And so it was almost embarrassing. We put up signs that said, this is a project of restoration. We're returning the land to its wild state. So it was embarrassing to have this wasteland behind the signs. But people were patient and neighbors were curious and were asking questions all the time about it. And gradually those plants grew up. And in addition to the, say, 20 or so native species we planted, we're now seeing other native species introduce themselves into the plot, which is always a sign that you're on the right track.
Yes.
Because that's when the land is taking over its own process of healing.
Right.
So that's been so exciting to see. And it's attracted
more birds, I bet.
Yeah, lots of
Right.
wildlife, and it's attracted lots of neighbors who wonder what is going on here, especially neighbors who think, wait, the church is doing ecological restoration work?
Right.
For those people, it doesn't always compute, given the church's history. But that's actually made for some really good conversations and good relationships with the neighbors as well. So that's an example of a project that goes beyond let's plant a garden. It's a lot more nuanced. It involves humility. It involves acknowledgement that, yeah, we've not been doing the right thing with this land. We've probably been abusing it. But then it involves taking the time to listen to the land and to develop a vision alongside the land for what it could become.
Community gardens are also a nice step, but they're still human focused.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's just acknowledging that, but the deeper layers of listening, that's what we do in Seminary of the Wild. How do we move from what our assumptions are and repent of our biases? You can't change them unless you can see them with humility. And then deeper than that, just to be able to use all your senses, all of the historical things and things you were talking about. And then also just the actual listening that the native peoples do. They listen to the trees. They have that direct conversation in a way that we are starting to remember, but it's been forgotten for so long. It takes a while. But it is possible to enter into essentially sacred conversation, even with somebody who's very, very different from you. They speak the language of mycelium, and we speak the language of English. And so we need to move out of our heads even to enter into that kind of conversation.
In community development, you often hear about empowerment, empowering the people to be their own solution, empowering the people to develop their own economy, et cetera, et cetera. But empowerment, when you really think about it, it's about one-way word. Empower means there's some person with the power who gives the power to people who need it. And that's often the case. It really is empowerment in a lot of ways in community development. But what is missing is that dynamic you're describing. If we want good things to happen, we need more of a collaborative approach. We need more of a mutual reliance. In the graduate program that I started in community development, we invented a word, co-powerment, as an alternative. So if you're going into a situation where you're starting an orphanage or wanting to help a village start a school, you can go in with your predefined and predetermined solution and impose it on people, and good things could happen, right? But if you take the time to do deep listening to the community first, to understand why there are orphans, to understand why there isn't a good school in the village, to understand what the challenges are, but also to understand what are the resources here, what are all the good and beautiful things that are already present in this space that could be brought together in a way that creates something new and helpful that's just much more sustainable because it's more intrinsic to a place. So that's the big change in community development that I and my students work for, but it does really apply to environmental work as well. And that's where you listen to the soil, where you pay attention to the life that is there, where you pay attention to history and water dynamics. You can't do good and sustainable work on your own. You have to see it as an interdependent relationship.
And that's the foundational worldview shift. Otherwise, it's still a species supremacy. It's a white supremacy. It's a male supremacy, whatever it is. Like, that we're so conditioned in our culture to the one-up kind of power. And so that, I think, is just so foundational. It's a humility that we are one of the beings that have particular gifts to bring, just as the trees have particular gifts, just as the soil has particular gifts. And so it is a relationship. It's restoring that actual kindred relationship, even if you don't use those words. You don't need to use those words, which is what I like about the word and the concept and the practice of conversation, like podcasts. A true conversation, you don't enter in saying, this is what I want this person to know. You enter in with an openness. The fact that the other person misunderstands you is the beginning of the conversation. because then you can understand how they misunderstood, and that shifts what you're saying. And it's a what'd you call it? Co-powerment.
Co-powerment, yeah.
It's a co-development. It's a co-creation
Yeah.
of aliveness.
Yeah, and as you say, I do actually think that relationship language that is maybe becoming more prevalent is setting people free to embrace this worldview shift. But even if you don't want to talk about relationship or a spiritual dynamic, you could just talk about ecology, because the fundamental premise of ecology is relationship, right?
Yeah. Everything is held together. Yeah.
Yeah. You take away the bees, well, there goes your whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
Right.
Your whole aliveness. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're just barely embracing that as a culture,
Yeah.
much less the deeper impact it has on our own spirituality and taking our place within the ecosystem. And that's really, I think, what the new story, what the vision, what the end game is for this whole movement. There's all kinds of nuances of it, but I think that's just so foundational. If we can't see ourselves as one of and see how we are a ecosystem together, and that I am not free until everyone's free. This has just been a message in that resistance movement throughout all of history. And that resistance movement has always been there and has always remained on the edges. But I feel that this big transition, that this worldview needs to be more than on the edges. And it's not like we have to become evangelists about it, but I think the more people that are awakened to it and live that way and are unafraid to do what Bethany Church did, to just say, you know what, when we listen, it does look messy at first. And we're okay with being in the unknown and the nighttime and the darkness and the death and the compost for as long as it needs to take for new life to come.
Well, that's the thing, though. There's lots and lots of examples of Christian communities all over the world doing this really cool stuff.
Well, even just looking in Seminary of the Wild, like we just brought Forrest on as one of our guides in Seminary of the Wild Earth, because this particular cohort is populated by a ton of pastors and other people who are within the institutional church. And it's the first time, it's probably 70% of the cohort. And other years, it's like maybe 20%. So it's just really fascinating. These are little clues to a bigger shift that is happening. Circlewood is a place where people can come to learn how to listen more deeply and do something proactive in their relationship with the land. But also, I'm just thinking about locally. Now that I live close, there's a need for us to draw together personally for the times that are continuing to unfold, and to not just hunker down and survive together, but to be co-creating what it means to be a spiritual person, what it means to be a human in the midst of this collapse. And I'm hoping that that's part of the vision too at Circlewood.
We have 40 acres of land on Camino Island that we really care for and are trying to restore back into health. And that's going really well. But it's turned out that through the podcast, Earthkeepers, and through the Ecological Disciple, we've been forming more of a global community of people who maybe feel alone in this work and who want to find their tribe. They want to feel like they're with other people who also value this need to reconnect to place, reconnect to ecologies. So we are continuing that work. We do want to expand our work more locally, and we have just completed a building on the land, which will be an education center. And already we've gathered cohorts of people. Our most recent cohort, for example, was a group of young folks in their 20s and 30s who were looking at vocation. What does my vocation have to do with being a good earthkeeper, a good citizen of creation, a good family member? And the discussions weren't about what kind of training do I need to be an arborist, but how can I, as a manager of a restaurant, also be an earthkeeper, right? We're developing, mostly under the guidance of our director, James Amadon, a model that we're calling the Journey of Ecological Discipleship.
Oh, that's great.
And it's aimed specifically at people in the Christ tradition, because we want to speak their language. We want to give them examples that come out of their culture. And so that's the people we're trying to help, and we're specializing in that. So with that model, I think we then have to decide how can we best help churches to apply that model to their congregations, but also how do we help individuals who are trying to make that journey as well. Essentially, the shape of the journey is leaving the old behind, leaving the confines of church culture and incomplete theology, journeying out to the edges to discover something new, to discover something better, different, more true in terms of our relationship to creation, and then returning closer to the center, where then we help other people perhaps to make that shift as well. So there's more steps to it than that, but that's the general trajectory, the shape of it.
Which is the shape of any transformation.
That's right. That's right.
Brilliant. Yeah.
And you have used the language of wilderness before, that you've got to leave the center and go to the wilderness sometimes in order to receive revelation and come back, right? So that's the model that we're developing. We're hoping to write a book soon, inspired by you and your amazing books. Right now, we're asking that question, how then do we apply this? And as I mentioned earlier, this fall, we're going to start a year-long series with the Wilderness Ministry at Bethany Community Church. And as we teach it, also see what people need. So we're shaping it even as we put it into practice.
Right. Always a co-creation. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I do want to ask you a personal question around your experience of growing closer to the land, those 40 acres of the land. What does that feel like to really invest in one place with your full being, your vocation? You've let go of other jobs. You've made this the center of your life. You're moving to Kamana. So what does that feel like? And how have you experienced that? And are there any particular places or beings that really have reached out to you for deeper intimacy?
That's a good question, because that is such a part of my transition right now. I don't live close to the land. I don't live on the island even. So there's a strange tension in me. We do our work there. Our offices are there. Whenever I drive up, I'm still a guest in a way. I haven't fully lived into a place, and I look forward to doing that. And so that's why I feel the need to actually move up to the island.
Yeah.
So I'm in that process now of making that transition. But one of my particular jobs right now is to landscape, quote unquote, the area around the new construction of our classroom community center. And it's that moonscape dilemma. Right now, it looks so awful. And the things I'm proposing are all about rewilding, all about wild plants. And you can't just change an ecology overnight. It was damaged land, and there's a lot of invasive species that dominate, particularly the area around the building. So the work of listening is happening. The work of replanting will happen more this fall as we clear some of the invasives to make way for more natives. But we dug a pond to try to follow the drain paths of the rainwater across the lot where the building is. So we put a pond at the end of that, so in the winter it will be a place where water collects. In my head, I've got this vision of a beautiful pond with native pond lilies and native iris. In the long run, it will be that. But right now, it's just a giant hole in the ground. And all that lives in it are mosquito larvae, millions of them. And I just stand at the edge of the pond and think, give me courage to believe that this will become something, right? So,
But that's part of the journey you were talking
it
about.
is.
It's like it doesn't go straight from leaving to returning. It doesn't go straight from Good Friday to Easter Sunday. There is that Holy Saturday that is all about grief. It's all about surrendering how you think things should be and your expectations. And I think the Christian church has skipped over that a lot. And so I think that is part of the journey. And so that journey of grief, of mosquito larvae, they must play some role in the restoration. And doesn't mean we have to like them. But it does mean it's real, and we are patient. That gives us patience in the place. We can be okay with creating some chaos in that letting go. And the resurrection is beyond us. Like, we can't make the plants grow. The only thing we have agency in is that in between, with patience, being in the unknowing, allowing the compost to do its thing, putting the cardboard on the lawn and letting it look ugly for a while, is holy. It's part of the sacred journey, and it's just as sacred as the new life of the butterfly is the cocoon of losing everything and becoming mush. That's sacred too.
I will say that there are moments of grace that keep me going. And last night I was actually home in my house in Edmonds, Washington, not on the island. And I was going up the stairs to go to bed, and I happened to glance out the window, and there, just standing in the street, was a really beautiful coyote.
Mm.
And I've heard them before, but I've never seen them in my neighborhood. But he was just standing there looking beautiful. And coyotes are not usually beautiful, but this one was just gorgeous. Right?
Wow.
It's like someone had groomed him or something. But I thought, I have a choice here. I can walk up the stairs and say, oh, cool, coyote. I'll tell my neighbors. Or I can say, this is a moment of grace.
Mm.
I am being honored to see this coyote.
Yes.
And not to hyper spiritualize it, but I felt like God is in this moment, in this place, in that coyote for me.
Absolutely.
And I went to bed with just a deep reassurance. That's all I felt. It's like, okay, in the midst of the stress of moving and all these other things happening in my life, it's going to be okay. That was what came to me.
That's so beautiful, because that is it. That's the deeper listening too. It's like, I don't remember where I read this, but it felt so right. I've adopted it myself, that wild beings choose to be seen by you. Like, they know you're there way before we know they're there. And so when that happens, we have to overcome our normal cultural dismissal of that into, this is something sacred. It's just like when you have a significant dream, these are encounters. Our dreams are also holy. They're encounters that we can just dismiss and go, that was weird, what I ate last night. Or we can really listen to them and let them be part of the change within us.
Well, I like your point that wild things choose to let us see them. I think there's another choice on our part. We choose to see the wild things.
There it is, yeah.
In certain ways, right? I thought about this actually, again, walking up the stairs after the coyote experience. I thought, in order to receive that moment, you have to be intentional and proactive. You have to be ready in a way and expecting something.
Yes.
Right? So, and that makes a difference. Otherwise, again, it's just a coyote that you happen to see.
Right.
And I did think about you because you've influenced me in this way to make me more intentional. I remember in our very first podcast episode, when you were on Earth Keepers, you talked about your experience with a goose and with grief. And at the time, it was very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It just was like, oh, wait, what? Isn't that just anthropomorphizing or imposing your vision on a goose? Right. But it isn't that. And I think both James and I, after that interview, really resolved to practice presence, to practice intentionality, to practice expectation and see what would come.
And it's that approach. I overquote this because it's so foundational. John O'Donohue. Whenever we approach anything, a child, a forest, whenever we approach anything with reverence, he says, great things decide to approach you. And so it gives agency to the other, to God, but it's a reciprocity. It requires our own choice, our own decision, our own practice. It takes some practice to undo worldview that is within the dominant culture, because we've, not just us, but our parents and their parents, and centuries of undoing. And so to be kind with ourselves when that happens, but it's an openness of willingness to engage in relationship.
And I would say that when you do start to experience that, it's just such a better way of living. Better in the sense that it's so much richer when meaning is all around, when relationship embraces you, when you belong to a place in fundamental ways and are aware of that belonging. It just makes for a better life.
So that was our own Forrest Inslee in conversation with Victoria Loorz, originally recorded for Victoria's podcast, The Holy Wild. We encourage you to listen to more episodes of The Holy Wild, which can be found on all major podcast channels. And I hope that you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. There's so much to digest and think about. I'm really grateful that Forrest shared about his journey of faith, from discovering some of the limitations of the tradition he was raised in, to looking at his career and vocation through a more expansive, creation-centered lens, to sharing that meaningful encounter with a neighborhood coyote. It made me think about what would happen if you and I reflect on our life in the same way. Where do we feel a sense of deep connection with all the life that surrounds us? with the great mystery of creation and with God. And I wonder, what if we took 15 minutes to think about this from the perspective of our own childhood and of our own current home and family, or our work and career, or our neighborhoods and our church? Where would we find life most open up for us? And where do we feel that sense of disconnection as well? Taking the time to reflect and pray in this way can open up new insights and possibilities for us. I hope you were encouraged and inspired by the discussion about Bethany Community Church and its work to rewild a portion of its property, as well as its creative wilderness ministry. What possibilities exist in your community? I know that sometimes they can be hard to see, but they are there. I'll end with an encouragement to practice the kind of presence Forrest and Victoria talk about, the attention that opens us up to the connections, all the life and the beauty that surrounds and enfolds us. Victoria paraphrased words from the poet and philosopher John O'Donohue, and I'll leave you with the exact quote from his book, Beauty, the Invisible Embrace, where he writes, "When we approach with reverence, great things decide to approach us. Our real life comes to the surface, and its light awakens the concealed beauty in things. When we walk on the earth with reverence, beauty will decide to trust us."
Earthkeepers Podcast is a production of Circlewood, an organization that encourages people to pursue a more ecologically conscious faith. Our executive producer is James Amadon, and our sound engineer is Dave Olfers. Jocelyn Gentry is our communications manager, and Forrest Reed and Levin Poltavsky are the composers of our original music. I am Forrest Inslee, your podcast host, and I'm really grateful for the time you spent listening to this episode. If you would, help us expand our reach by following or subscribing to this podcast on your favorite listening platform. And be sure to go to our website to sign up for a podcast newsletter. If you know someone who would benefit from hearing this podcast conversation, it would be great if you could send them a link. In any case, I hope you'll join us again for our next episode of the Earthkeepers Podcast.